This is the brand new Dell XPS 17-9720, and it is so good, I bought it twice. Seriously. But given this looks identical to last year's model and the one the year before that, is this just a case of Dell-ja vu? Hey guys, I'm Tom Tech Chap, and if you saw my first impressions video of this, then you'll know that I basically bought the wrong spec. I skimped on the CPU and the GPU, but paid way too much money for like 64 gigs of RAM. So I returned that one and bought this, which is the top spec version with the i9, with the 3060, so we can really see what this new XPS 17 can do. Now, I always look forward to a new XPS laptop, especially the 17, and from what I read in the comments on my first impressions video, those of you that have a 17 seem to love them as well. And I totally get it. It's an absolutely gorgeous laptop with this big 17-inch 16:10 screen with these super thin bezels, and it's all squeezed into a lovely slim and compact aluminium chassis with Dell's trademark carbon fiber palm rest, and of course that lovely and massive trackpad. And performance is no slouch either. You can spec this with up to a 12th gen i9 12900HK CPU, an RTX 3060 GPU, up to 64 gigs of DDR5 RAM, and up to 2 terabytes of PCIe 4 SSD storage, and of course the optional 4K touchscreen. Then there's the vapor chamber cooling, a chiclet keyboard that's as nice to use as ever, and while there is still no numpad, which I know frustrates some of you guys, instead Dell has shoehorned in some actually pretty good speakers. Up top, there's a 720p webcam with Windows Hello, plus we get a fingerprint reader in the power button, and also having 4 Thunderbolt 4 enabled USB-C ports and a full-size SD card reader. I pretty much have all the ports I need, except of course for USB-A and HDMI, which is where this comes in. Dell bundles this little dongle adapter in the box, so as long as you carry that with you, you're all set. All good stuff then, but except for the CPU and the RAM, everything else is pretty much the same as the cheaper 2021 version. And actually for most people, I think that's going to be a better buy if you can find one. And the other issue with this is that the RTX 3060 graphics card I have in here is actually the same one as last year, but with a lower TGP. It's a 65 watt part rather than 70 watts. Also, the entry-level 17 starts at £2,100 in the UK, or in the US, it's about $1,850 for the base model, because that actually comes with a lower spec i5 and also no GPU. It relies on the integrated graphics alone. But then on the other side, top spec models like this will cost you about $3,700. So for the best part of $4,000, if you want the super duper top spec model, well, it's worth considering if your money is better spent elsewhere. So the main upgrade this year is the fact that we get Intel's 12th gen H-series CPUs, which have a slightly redesigned architecture, and also this comes with faster onboard Iris Xe graphics. The other change for this year is the fact that we get DDR5 RAM. This is the new standard for high-end laptops, although the faster speeds aren't really something you probably notice in everyday use. And as I say, that's pretty much it, which does feel disappointing when we look at laptops from, say, ASUS, where there's some pretty big innovation and we're getting high refresh and OLEDs and fancy ASUS dials that, really pushing the boat out. With this, I think maybe if we had Wi-Fi 6E, which bizarrely we still don't, or maybe even a 90Hz or 120Hz refresh, or just something else, it would be easier to recommend upgrading to it. For me, I was kind of hoping for an XPS 17 Plus style upgrade along the lines of the new XPS 13 Plus. Hopefully though, that's more of a sign of things to come, and fingers crossed we get a big revamp next year. Now the Dell does have a slightly bigger 17-inch versus 16-inch screen on the MacBook, but you can see it's a little bit wider, it's a little bit thicker, although it's about the same weight with that 4K screen, which does add a little bit to the weight. It's a little bit lighter if you go full HD. The build quality is still top-notch. There's no creaks, there's no flexing, and the tapering edges around the base give the sides a much slimmer appearance than it actually has. And I do still really like the carbon fiber. It almost has a soft touch feel to it, although it does still get smudgy over time. Not sure about this webcam though. Look at that noise. The quality really isn't very good, and certainly not as good as what you get on the MacBook Pros or even the new ASUS ZenBooks with their upgraded 1080p webcams. This is still 720p, it's on the top bezel, and even with this really good lighting, quality's a bit naff if I'm honest. But while I have you, I want to show you this. Surfshark VPN. They are very kindly sponsoring this video, and if you are a regular on the channel, then you'll know that I use this all the time. As you know, VPNs are incredibly useful for accessing content and websites that are in other countries, and also, more importantly, staying safe online, as it helps to prevent tracking and ads and malware and all those nasty things. And for me, that's one of the big reasons I use Surfshark, because we have this clean web tool. You can also get the app for pretty much every device, and there's even browser extensions. It's so simple and easy to use, but the best part is if you use the code TechChap or click the link below, you can get 83% off and 3 months extra for free. I think everyone should be using VPNs, and I would definitely recommend trying out Surfshark. Let's talk about the screen though, because there are still two options, same as last year, either a Full HD Plus non-touch screen or a 4K Plus touchscreen, which is not only sharper, but it's also a bit more color accurate, and the 4K version gets the nicer sort of edge-to-edge glass bezel. Bring up this one, this is actually the XPS 15, which I'm working on a video for. This is the Full HD version, and you might be able to see, while the bezels are still very thin, they are actually a little bit proud of the screen, and they are plastic. It doesn't look quite as premium as the 4K version, which you'll also see is a glossy rather than matte screen, but we do get an anti-reflective coating. You can see, obviously, the difference in the reflectivity. This is the 15, but you'll get the same experience on the Full HD with the 17. So while I think for me, I would go 4K because I want the extra sharpness, I want the extra color accuracy because I do photo and video editing, and I think particularly on the 17-inch with the bigger size, you're gonna sort of really appreciate the 4K resolution a bit more than on the 15, but as I say, Full HD is cheaper, it's matte, and it's also gonna give you a much better battery life. Now flipping it over and unscrewing the base, we can get a much better look at that vapor chamber cooling system, which is much beefier than the system we get on the XPS 15. And also, of course, unlike a MacBook Pro, you can upgrade the RAM and the SSD if you want. As for temperatures, well, last year's 17 did get pretty toasty around the keyboard, especially under load, but I'm pleased to report things do seem to be cooler this year, whether it's the efficiency gains with the CPU or just because we're having a lower TGP GPU. And I ran a 20-minute TimesBy stress test which showed no appreciable drop in performance. And it was the same story when I ran Furmark and Prime 95 together for another 20 minutes. It's also silent for most of the time, with the fans only really whirring up during sustained loads. To be fair, it's no MacBook Pro, which is pretty much silent all the time, but for a Windows laptop, it's mostly unobtrusive. It's no surprise that this top spec model that costs nearly $4,000 is pretty quick, and in my everyday use with raw photo editing and editing 4K 10-bit 422 footage in Premiere Pro, it performed really well, and for the most part it's the premium experience you would expect at this price. But the big surprise for me was just how much faster this new CPU is versus last year's i9. In Cinebench, the new 12th Gen i9 was 21% faster in single core and a whopping 44% faster in multi-core. And it's a similar story in the Geekbench 5 single core test, while in multi-core it was a full 50% faster than last year. However, as I mentioned earlier on, there is a compromise, and that is the GPU, which is the same RTX 3060 in the higher end model like I have here, the same graphics card, but with a 65 watt rather than a 70 watt TGP. So it's actually gone down in power, which results in a 5% slower score in an OpenCL Geekbench test and a 6% slower score in TimesBy, which is not exactly what you want to see. Now this really is designed as a sort of creator laptop, a semi-workstation if you will, but you can of course still play games on it. And by dropping the resolution to a more sensible Full HD+, you can max out graphics settings and still hit 60 FPS, and frequently a lot more than that, but we are still limited by that 60Hz panel. And actually, results were pretty similar to what I saw with last year's model, mainly because we're more CPU bound at this resolution and less subject to the lower TGPs. But importantly, the 3060 is anywhere from 25 up to 33% faster than the 3050. And it comes with an extra 2 gigs of VRAM, which will come in handy at the higher 4K resolution. So I reckon the 3060 is definitely worth paying the extra for. But also, as my benchmarks show, there really isn't a big difference between the i7 and the i9, given they're basically the same chip, just with a small base and boost clock difference. So the takeaway is, if you're thinking about buying this, I would go with the i7 with the 3060, 16 gigs of RAM, or maybe 32 if you are doing more intensive like video editing, but you can always upgrade it yourself later, and also a 1TB SSD. That is the configuration I would recommend. Battery life is actually pretty decent, although obviously it varies depending on your use and also the spec you go for, and of course whether you have the Full HD or the 4K screen. But unlike the XPS 15, all models of the 17 come with a larger 97 watt-hour battery, which means the Full HD Plus XPS 17 is going to give you the longest battery life. 1 hour of YouTube used around 13% of the battery, compared to 15% on last year's model and actually 19% on the 2020 version. So the battery life is actually a little bit better, and on average you can expect around 7 or 8 hours of everyday use. So, the big question, should you actually buy this? Well, yeah, I think it's still worth considering. I do like that in the US and I guess some other countries there is that i5 non-GPU option, which is actually a lot cheaper, so if you just want a big premium 17-inch laptop. But for me, I always consider the 17 a bit of a work laptop. I can edit on this at home or when I'm traveling, and it does pretty much everything I need. The elephant in the room though is that it's just a bit boring. There is not that much new here. The CPUs are a good deal faster, so if the programs you're running are very sort of CPU demanding, then that may be worth the upgrade. But then the compromise is that lower power graphics card, and it really is long overdue either an OLED or a mini LED option, and of course a high 90 or 120 Hz refresh rate. What I would consider though is if you can find it, if you don't mind the slightly older 11th gen i7 and slower DDR4 RAM, you can get otherwise an identical 2021 XPS 17 with an RTX 3060 and 16 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte and a 4K screen for almost $700 less than this. As an alternative, I would definitely take a look at the new Asus ZenBook Pro 16X, which I think gives you a lot more for your money. I personally would suggest getting the MacBook Pro 14 or 16 instead. The performance with the M1 Pro and Max, even on battery life, it stays cool and quiet constantly, you never hear the fans. We get the ProMotion screen as well as better speakers, a better webcam. I just think it's a better all-round laptop. But what about you? Would you consider buying the new XPS 17? And also, if you've got any questions at all, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, a cheeky little like and subscribe would be very much appreciated. And I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat. Oh, and don't forget to check out Surfshark VPN. Click the link below or use the code TechChat to get 83% off and 3 months extra for free.